The cafeteria of Pinewood Community College smelled of fresh bread and coffee on a Monday morning in late September. A new worker stood behind the counter, her gray-streaked hair pulled back in a simple bun. Lynn was 48, with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled, which wasn't often these days. Her hands moved with quiet efficiency as she arranged pastries in the display case, the skin slightly rough from years of work. "Excuse me, could I get a coffee, please?" A young man in a hurried suit waited impatiently, tapping his credit card on the counter. Lynn nodded, reaching for a paper cup. "Regular or large?" "Large, black." He barely looked up from his phone. Lynn prepared his coffee with care despite his distraction, adding a small cookie on the side of the saucer. The young man, a music theory professor according to his ID badge, glanced up in surprise at the extra touch. "I didn't order that." "First day special," Lynn said softly. "No charge." He hesitated, then took the cookie with a small nod that wasn't quite a thank you before rushing off to his morning class. Lynn watched him go, then continued with her work. The college had hired her 3 weeks ago, and she'd kept to herself since starting. The cafeteria manager had been pleased with her reliability and careful work, even if she was unusually quiet. By lunchtime, the cafeteria bustled with activity. Students laughed and argued over textbooks while professors huddled in corners discussing department politics. Lynn moved between tables, clearing trays and wiping surfaces. Her movements were economical, almost invisible. Few people noticed her, and those who did quickly forgot her presence. She preferred it that way. At the far end of the cafeteria, a table of music department faculty gathered for their weekly lunch meeting. They were a lively bunch, gesturing dramatically as they spoke. Their voices carried across the room. "The fall concert series is coming up short," said a woman with bright red glasses and wild curly hair. "We need at least 3 more performances to fill the program." "What about the new jazz ensemble?" suggested a man with a bow tie. "Already scheduled for the opening night," said another, shuffling through papers. "We need something unexpected, something to get people talking." Lynn kept her head down as she approached their table, gathering empty plates. One of the professors had left sheet music next to his coffee cup. As Lynn reached for a napkin, her eyes fell on the notes. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, her favorite piece to play on lazy Sunday mornings. Her fingers twitched slightly before she caught herself. "Excuse me," she murmured, reaching for the last plate. The professor with the bow tie looked up. "Oh, thank you." He paused, realizing he'd never noticed her before. "Sorry, are you new here?" "Started a few weeks ago," Lynn replied, balancing the tray of dishes. "Well, welcome to Pinewood," he said with a distracted smile before turning back to his colleagues. Lynn nodded and moved away. As she walked toward the kitchen, she paused near the open door that led to the main hallway. From somewhere down the corridor, the delicate notes of a piano floated through the air. Someone was practicing, their touch hesitant on the keys. Lynn closed her eyes for just a moment, letting the music wash over her. "Something wrong with those dishes?" The cafeteria manager's voice broke her reverie. "No, sorry," Lynn said, continuing to the kitchen. Later that afternoon, when her shift ended, Lynn didn't immediately head to the bus stop as usual. Instead, she found herself walking toward the music building. It was an old structure with tall windows and ivy climbing the brick walls. Students hurried in and out, instrument cases slung over their shoulders. Lynn stood across the small courtyard watching. A bench beneath a maple tree offered a perfect view of the building's entrance. She sat down, telling herself she was just resting before the long bus ride home. Through the open windows came the sounds of practice rooms, scales and arpeggios, fragments of sonatas and concertos. Some played with impressive skill. Others stumbled through simple exercises. Lynn listened to it all, her face unreadable. A young woman exited the building, struggling with a large cello case. She nearly tripped on the steps, and Lynn half rose from her seat, ready to help. But the student recovered and continued on her way, unaware of Lynn's concern. As the afternoon light began to fade, fewer students came and went. Lynn knew she should leave, but something kept her rooted to the bench. When the lamps along the pathways flickered on, she finally stood, adjusting her worn shoulder bag. "Do you play?" Lynn startled at the voice. The professor with the bow tie from lunch stood nearby, a leather satchel in hand. "I'm sorry?" "An instrument," he clarified. "I noticed you listening." Most people hurry past without hearing a note. Lynn shook her head, just enjoying the music. He nodded thoughtfully. I'm Professor Chen. I teach music theory and composition. Lynn, she offered simply. I work in the cafeteria. Well, Lynn from the cafeteria, you're welcome to listen anytime. We have free concerts every Friday evening in the recital hall. He pointed to a smaller building connected to the main one. Student performances mostly, but occasionally faculty as well. Thank you, Lynn said. I should go. Bus to catch. Professor Chen waved goodbye as Lynn hurried toward the campus exit. The bus ride to her apartment took 40 minutes. Lynn stared out the window at the passing city, her reflection ghostly in the glass. The other passengers paid her no mind, just another tired worker heading home after a long day. Her apartment building was old but well kept, tucked between a laundromat and a small grocery store. Lynn climbed the 3 flights of stairs slowly, her legs heavy with fatigue. The hallway smelled of someone's cooking, something with garlic and ginger that reminded her of childhood. Her own apartment was sparsely furnished. A small sofa, a coffee table, a bookshelf with just a few books. The kitchen was neat and functional with mismatched plates and cups. Nothing about the space suggested anything remarkable about its occupant, except for what stood in the corner of the living room, an upright piano covered with a thick cloth. Lynn set down her bag and coat, then moved to the kitchen to prepare a simple dinner. She ate at the small table by the window, occasionally glancing at the covered shape. After washing her dishes, Lynn stood in the middle of the room, hesitating. Then with a decisive motion, she pulled the cloth from the piano. The instrument was old but beautiful, its wood glowing warmly in the apartment's soft light. Lynn ran her fingers over the closed lid, removing a fine layer of dust. She hadn't opened it in months. She sat on the bench, adjusted its height from memory, and lifted the lid. Her fingers hovered over the keys without touching them. In her mind, she could hear the music from the practice rooms earlier that day, the stumbling students, the confident professors. Lynn pressed one key. A clear A-flat rang through the apartment. She closed her eyes and pressed another. Then another. Not a song, just individual notes, like testing the waters of a pool before diving in. Her phone buzzed with a text message. Lynn closed the piano lid gently and went to check it. Her evening routine resumed. A shower, a cup of tea, preparations for tomorrow's early shift. But something had changed. As she lay in bed that night, Lynn's fingers moved slightly against the blanket, playing invisible keys in a silent melody. For the first time in years, she fell asleep thinking of music instead of trying to forget it. The next morning, Lynn arrived at work early. She moved through her preparations with the same quiet efficiency as always, but occasionally her head would tilt slightly, as if listening to something only she could hear. When the music theory professor came for his morning coffee, she had it ready. Black, large, she said, sliding it across the counter. He looked up from his phone in surprise. You remembered, Lynn offered a small smile. And a cookie. Not a first-day special today. Just because it's Tuesday. He actually laughed. Thank you, Lynn from the cafeteria. You're welcome, Professor Chen from music theory. As he walked away with his coffee, Lynn found herself wondering about the Friday concerts. Perhaps just once she might attend. Just to listen. Nothing more, she wouldn't play again. She had promised herself that years ago. But listening might be safe enough. Lynn wiped down the counter and prepared for the morning rush, humming softly under her breath. The tune was the Chopin nocturne she had spotted yesterday, though no one in the bustling cafeteria would have recognized it or understood its significance. For now, that secret remained hers alone. 2 weeks passed. Lynn had fallen into a comfortable routine at Pinewood Community College. The cafeteria staff now greeted her with warm smiles, and several professors knew her by name. Professor Chen, the music theory teacher, often lingered at her counter for a few extra moments of conversation. You know, he said one morning, stirring sugar into his coffee, I've noticed you walking by the practice rooms after your shift. His tone was casual, but his eyes were curious. Lynn focused on wiping down the counter. The music is nice. Helps clear my head before the bus ride home. You should come to our faculty meeting today. We're having it in the cafeteria during lunch. Lynn raised an eyebrow. I'll be working. I know, but you might find it interesting. We're discussing the annual talent show. Before Lin could respond, a line formed behind him. Professor Chen tipped an imaginary hat and moved away, leaving Lin to wonder what he was up to. The faculty talent show, as Lin learned during her shift, was a yearly fundraiser for music scholarships. Professors from all departments performed, often with humorous results. The music faculty, being professionals, usually chose to work behind the scenes rather than perform. It's a chance for the physics professors to prove they can't sing and the literature department to demonstrate why they write instead of dance, explained a cheerful woman from the art department who was painting small flyers at one of the tables. Lin smiled politely as she cleared nearby trays, half listening to the meeting. "We need something different this year," said a stern-looking man at the head of the table. Lin recognized him as Dean Wright, head of the music department. "Last year's show was too predictable. What about involving some of the staff?" suggested Professor Chen. "Maintenance, administration, cafeteria workers?" Lin froze, a stack of plates in her hands. "That's actually not a bad idea," said the dean, stroking his gray beard. "Community building and all that." "Anyone have someone in mind?" Professor Chen's hand went up immediately. "The new cafeteria worker, Lin. She seems interested in music." All heads turned toward Lin, who was trying to make herself invisible near the busing station. "You there," called Dean Wright. "Come over here for a moment, please." Lin considered pretending she hadn't heard, but several people were watching. Slowly, she set down her tray and approached the table. "Do you play an instrument?" asked the dean without preamble. "No," Lin said quietly. "Sing?" "No," the dean frowned. "Chen says you're interested in music." "I just enjoy listening," Lin explained, wishing she could disappear. "Everyone can do something," insisted a woman with bright purple hair. "Dance, recite poetry?" Lin shook her head. "Well, what do you enjoy about music?" pressed the dean. "Piano," Lin admitted reluctantly. "I like piano music." The table erupted in satisfied murmurs. "Perfect," said the dean, clapping his hands once. "We have several pieces that would be suitable for a beginner. Something simple that would still sound impressive with minimal skill." "Actually," interrupted Professor Chen with a mischievous glint in his eye, "I have a better idea. What about Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3? A stunned silence fell over the table. "That's one of the most difficult pieces in the repertoire," protested the purple-haired woman. "Exactly," said Professor Chen. "The contrast would be amusing. We'd arrange a simplified version, of course." Lin's heart pounded in her chest. "I really don't play nonsense," said the dean, warming to the idea. "It's perfect. The audience will love it. The cafeteria worker attempting one of the most challenging pieces ever written." "I can help you practice," offered Professor Chen. "Just the opening few bars. We'll make it work." "The talent show is in 2 weeks," said the dean. "That should be plenty of time to learn a simplified version." He turned to Lin with what he probably thought was an encouraging smile. "You'll be a hit, trust me." Lin opened her mouth to refuse, but the cafeteria manager appeared at her side. "What a wonderful opportunity," the manager said, beaming. "Of course you'll participate. It's great publicity for the cafeteria staff." Trapped Lin could only nod. "Excellent," said the dean. "Chen will get you the music tomorrow. Just do your best, that's all we ask." The meeting broke up, professors chattering excitedly about other acts and logistics. Lin returned to her work, movements mechanical as her mind raced. Professor Chen approached her as she was finishing her shift. "I'm sorry if that put you on the spot," he said, looking genuinely concerned. "I thought you might enjoy being part of the show. You always seem so interested in the music building." "It's fine," Lin said, not meeting his eyes. "Here," he said, handing her a folder. "I brought this for you. It's the sheet music. I've marked some simplified sections." Lin took the folder without opening it. "The piece isn't as difficult as everyone makes it sound," Professor Chen continued, clearly trying to be helpful. "Just focus on the melody in the right hand. The left hand can be simplified." Lin nodded, clutching the folder to her chest. "Do you have access to a piano for practice?" he asked. "Yes," Lin said shortly, then softened at his concerned expression. "I have one at home. Wonderful. If you need any help, my office hours are posted on my door. Room 213 in the music building." Lin thanked him and hurried away, the folder heavy in her hands. That evening, her apartment felt smaller than usual. The covered piano in the corner seemed to take up more space, demanding her attention. Lin prepared and ate her dinner without tasting it. her eyes repeatedly drawn to the sheet music folder she'd placed on the coffee table. After washing the dishes, she finally sat on the couch and opened it. Rachmaninoff's Third Piano Concerto stared back at her, the notes familiar as old friends. Professor Chen had indeed marked simplified sections, crossing out complex passages and writing alternatives in the margins. Lynn almost laughed. Even simplified, this piece would challenge most amateur pianists. She closed the folder and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. She hadn't touched a piano properly in 5 years. Not since the accident that had taken her husband and damaged her left hand. Lynn flexed her fingers, feeling the familiar stiffness in her ring and little fingers on her left hand. The doctors had told her she was lucky. Most of her hand function had returned. But for someone who had once played the most demanding pieces in the classical repertoire, the slight weakness and occasional tremor had felt like the end of everything. Her husband had been driving her home from a concert when the truck hit them. He died instantly. Lynn spent months in recovery, first for her physical injuries, then for the depression that followed. When she finally returned to their apartment, she couldn't bear to touch the piano. Eventually, she sold their grand piano and moved to a smaller place, bringing only the upright from her childhood home. 5 years of silence. 5 years of avoiding concert halls and recital programs. 5 years of building a new life where no one knew she had once been Lin Wei, acclaimed concert pianist with international tours and recording contracts. And now this, being asked to play one of the most difficult concertos ever written. As a joke, Lynn turned from the window and walked to the piano. She removed the cloth and sat on the bench, placing the sheet music on the stand. Her fingers hovered over the keys. The first notes of Rachmaninoff's Third came back to her without effort. She had performed it with the Beijing Symphony Orchestra 15 years ago to rave reviews. Critics had praised her technical brilliance and emotional depth. Lynn began to play just the opening melody, soft and questioning. Her left hand joined hesitantly, finding the bass notes. The familiar music filled her small apartment, awakening memories she had tried to forget. She stopped abruptly when her left hand faltered on a chord. Frustration welled up inside her. Once this piece had flowed from her fingers like water. Now she struggled with the basic opening. Just the melody, she whispered to herself, echoing Professor Chen's advice. Just the simplified version. But her pride rebelled at the thought. If she was going to play again, if she was going to face an audience after all this time, she wouldn't play a watered-down version of a masterpiece. She would play it properly, or not at all. Lynn closed the piano and replaced the cloth. She would need to practice to rebuild the strength in her left hand. 2 weeks wasn't much time, but she had once prepared this concerto in a month when another pianist fell ill before a festival. She had nowhere near the skill she once possessed. Years without practice had taken their toll, but something had awakened inside her, a flicker of the passion that had once defined her life. For the first time in years, Lynn set her alarm clock an hour earlier than necessary. She would practice before work and again after returning home. Just small sessions at first, building slowly. Whether this talent show would be a triumph or a humiliation remained to be seen. But as Lynn prepared for bed that night, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the quiet determination that had once carried her from a small town in China to concert halls around the world. Professor Chen and Dean Wright had meant to assign her an impossible task as a joke. They had no idea they might have just given her a reason to live again. The next morning, Lynn's alarm went off at 4:30 a.m. She blinked in the darkness, momentarily confused by the early hour. Then she remembered. She slipped out of bed and made a cup of strong tea. The apartment was quiet, the world outside still asleep. Lynn removed the cloth from the piano and sat down, flexing her fingers. She began with simple exercises, scales and arpeggios moving up and down the keyboard. Her left hand felt stiff, the pinky and ring finger slightly slower to respond than they once had. For 30 minutes, she worked through basic finger patterns, feeling the familiar burn in her muscles. 5 years of neglect had taken their toll. Before the accident, she could practice for 6 hours without significant fatigue. Now, after just half an hour, her left hand was trembling. Lynn stopped, massaging her palm and studying her hand in the dim light. The scars had faded to thin white lines barely visible unless you knew where to look. The physical therapist had been amazed by her recovery. "Most people with your injury would never regain this much function," he had told her. But he hadn't understood what this much meant to a concert pianist. The milliseconds of delay, the slight weakness in her fourth finger, the occasional tremor after extended use. These small deficits had seemed insurmountable to someone whose life had been defined by technical perfection. Lynn closed the piano and got ready for work. On the bus, she did finger exercises in her lap, pressing each finger against her thumb in sequence. A teenage boy across the aisle watched her curiously. Lynn gave him a small smile and continued her silent practice. At the college cafeteria, Lynn moved through her morning tasks with mechanical efficiency. Her mind was elsewhere, running through passages of Rachmaninoff while she prepared coffee and set out pastries. Professor Chen appeared at his usual time, but today he wasn't alone. Dean Wright accompanied him, both men heading straight for Lynn's counter. "Good morning," said the dean, studying her with new interest. "Chen tells me you have a piano at home." Lynn nodded, pouring their coffees. "Excellent. We've reserved practice room 3 for you during your lunch break if you'd like to use it." The dean spoke as if he were bestowing a great honor. "It has one of our better upright pianos." "That's very kind," Lynn said, "but I bring my lunch and usually eat in the staff room." "You can eat afterward," said the dean dismissively. "This is more important. The talent show is a major fundraiser for our scholarship program." Lynn felt a flicker of annoyance at his tone, but kept her expression neutral. "I'll try to stop by." "Wonderful. We're all very excited to see what you can do." The dean took his coffee and walked away, already focused on his next task. Professor Chen lingered, looking apologetic. "Don't mind him. He gets intense about the talent show." He lowered his voice. "The practice room offer is genuine, though. It might be easier than trying to practice at home with neighbors." Lynn considered this. Her apartment walls were thin, and she'd already received one complaint from her downstairs neighbor about the noise this morning. "Where is practice room 3? She asked. Professor Chen smiled. "First floor of the music building, end of the hallway."
"I'll leave the key at the front desk."
"It's yours from 12 to 1 every day until the show." During her morning break, Lynn slipped away to the music building. She'd never been inside before, having only listened from the courtyard. The front desk attendant, a bored-looking student, handed her a key without interest. Practice room 3 was small but clean, with soundproofed walls and a window high on one wall. The upright piano was older than her own but well-maintained. Lynn ran her fingers over the keys without pressing them, feeling the smoothness of the ivory. She glanced at her watch. She only had 10 minutes before she needed to return to work. Not enough time to practice properly, but enough to test the instrument. Lynn sat down and began to play the opening of Rachmaninoff's Third. The piano had a warmer tone than hers, with slightly heavier action that required more finger strength. She made a mental note to adjust her touch tomorrow when she had more time. As she was leaving, she nearly collided with a young woman in the hallway. "Sorry," Lynn murmured, stepping aside. The young woman stared at her with wide eyes. "Was that you playing just now?" Lynn nodded, uncomfortable with the attention. "That was Rachmaninoff's Third," the student said. "Are you a new professor? I thought I knew all the piano faculty." "No, I work in the cafeteria," Lynn said, moving toward the exit. "Excuse me, I need to get back to my shift." She could feel the student's confused gaze following her as she hurried away. During her lunch break, Lynn returned to practice room 3 with her small packed lunch. She ate quickly, then spent 40 minutes working through the first movement of the concerto. Her fingers stumbled over passages that had once been effortless, and she had to simplify some of the left-hand patterns. Still, the music was coming back to her, muscle memory awakening after years of dormancy. She didn't notice the small crowd that had gathered in the hallway, listening through the door. When Lynn emerged, surprised to find several students and a couple of professors standing nearby, they quickly dispersed, pretending they hadn't been eavesdropping. One older professor with thick glasses lingered. "Interesting interpretation," he said, studying her with sharp eyes. "Your left hand is weak in the development section, but your phrasing in the main theme shows unusual maturity for an amateur." Lynn mumbled a thank you and hurried back to the cafeteria, arriving 5 minutes late. The manager raised an eyebrow but said nothing. That evening, Lynn practiced for 2 hours, focusing on the problematic development section. Her left hand tired quickly, forcing her to take frequent breaks. Frustration built inside her as she struggled with passages that should have been simple. 5 years, she whispered to herself. What did you expect? She found an old recording of her performance with the Beijing Symphony Orchestra and played it on her small Bluetooth speaker. The confident, flawless playing seemed to belong to someone else entirely. Lynn listened with her eyes closed, fingers moving in her lap, following along with her younger self. When the recording ended, she returned to the piano with renewed determination. She couldn't play at that level again, but she could do better than she was doing now. Days passed in a new routine. Early morning practice at home, work at the cafeteria, lunch break in practice room 3, evening practice at home until her hands could do no more. Word spread through the music department about the cafeteria worker who was attempting Rachmaninoff. Students began to find excuses to pass by practice room 3 during her lunch break. Professor Chen stopped by her counter one morning, looking concerned. People are talking, he said quietly. Someone said you're actually quite good. Lynn shrugged. I'm doing my best. The thing is, he continued, lowering his voice, the talent show is supposed to be, well, not entirely serious. If you're really preparing the full concerto, I'm playing what I can play, Lynn interrupted. Isn't that what you wanted? Professor Chen looked uncomfortable. Of course. It's just, Dean Wright was expecting something more. Amateur? Lynn supplied. Well, yes, he admitted. It's part of the charm of the event. The physics professors sing off-key. The literature department performs terrible poetry. Everyone laughs, we raise money for scholarships, no one gets embarrassed. Lynn considered this as she wiped down the counter. What would you like me to do? Maybe simplify it more? Play with deliberate mistakes? He looked immediately ashamed of the suggestion. I'm sorry, that was inappropriate. Play however you'd like, of course. After he left, Lynn thought about his words throughout her shift. The talent show was meant to be amusing, with professors poking fun at themselves. Her suddenly serious preparation didn't fit the spirit of the event, but she couldn't bring herself to deliberately play poorly. Not this piece. Not after working so hard to reclaim even a fraction of her former skill. During her lunch practice, she was surprised by a knock on the door. She opened it to find the older professor with thick glasses who had commented on her playing earlier. Professor Wu. He introduced himself, extending a hand. Piano performance and music history. Lynn shook his hand cautiously. Lynn Cafeteria, may I? He asked, gesturing to the piano. Lynn stepped aside, allowing him to enter. He sat at the piano and played a few measures of the Rachmaninoff, his technique precise if somewhat academic. You have an unusual approach to the cadenza, he said, standing up. Eastern European training. Lynn hesitated. Chinese conservatory originally. Professor Wu nodded thoughtfully. Your left hand has an injury. It wasn't a question. Lynn instinctively curled her left hand into a fist. I had a student once with a similar issue, he continued. We modified some fingerings, redistributed certain passages between the hands. It helped considerably. He pulled a pencil from his pocket and reached for her sheet music. May I? For the remaining 20 minutes of her break, Professor Wu worked through several difficult passages with her, offering alternative fingerings and hand positions that put less strain on her weaker fingers. The talent show is in 4 days, he said as they finished. Come to my office tomorrow during your break. I have some exercises that might help with the specific issues in your 4th and 5th fingers. Why are you helping me? Lynn asked. Professor Wu smiled slightly. Let's just say I'm curious to see Dean Wright's face when you play. He paused at the door. And because music like this deserves to be played properly, even at a talent show. As Lynn returned to the cafeteria, she felt something shift inside her. For the first time since beginning this unexpected journey, she found herself looking forward to the performance with something other than dread. She wasn't the pianist she had once been. She never would be again. But with Professor Wu's modifications and her own growing determination, she might still create something beautiful, and perhaps that was enough. The day before the talent show, the music building buzzed with activity. Students carried instruments and equipment across campus. Professors argued about the program order, and maintenance staff set up rows of chairs in the large performance hall. Lynn worked her regular shift in the cafeteria, serving coffee to frazzled faculty members who barely noticed her. Professor Chen had been avoiding her for days, ever since their uncomfortable conversation about deliberate mistakes. Dean Wright, on the other hand, seemed to have forgotten about her entirely, focused on more important performers. During her lunch break, Lynn went to practice room 3 for the last time. Tomorrow she would play on the grand piano in the performance hall, a brief rehearsal in the morning before her afternoon shift. Then the actual performance in the evening. She sat at the familiar upright piano, letting her fingers rest lightly on the keys without pressing them. Over the past 2 weeks, she had slowly reconnected with the musician she used to be. Her left hand would never be what it once was, but Professor Wu's modifications had helped tremendously. She could now play a respectable version of the first movement, not the full concerto, but enough to show what the piece could be. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Professor Wu entered carrying a small paper bag. "I brought you something," he said, placing the bag on top of the piano. "Tea, a special blend with ginger and other herbs that help with inflammation. Drink it tonight and tomorrow morning." Lynn thanked him. "You've been very kind." "Not kind," he corrected. "Selfish. I miss hearing this concerto played well." He sat on a spare chair in the corner. "Will you play the cadenza for me?" One last time, Lynn nodded and began to play. The cadenza, an extended solo passage where the pianist showcases their technical and expressive abilities, had always been her favorite part of the concerto. Under Professor Wu's guidance, she had reworked it to accommodate her limitations while preserving its essential character. When she finished, Professor Wu nodded with satisfaction. "Good, very good." "Not like it used to be," Lynn said quietly. "No," he agreed, "but beautiful in a different way. Before, perhaps you played with more technical brilliance. Now there is something else, a depth that comes only from loss." Lynn looked away, uncomfortable with his perception. "You were a professional once, weren't you?" he asked after a moment's hesitation. Lynn nodded. "I thought so. No one develops that kind of musical understanding without years of serious study." He didn't press for details, and Lynn was grateful. "Whatever happens tomorrow, remember that music doesn't demand perfection, only truth." After he left, Lynn remained at the piano thinking about his words. For so long she had defined herself by what she had lost. The flawless technique, the international career, her husband who had supported her through it all. She had stopped playing because she couldn't bear to confront the gap between what she had been and what she was now, but perhaps there was value in that gap, in the journey from who she had been to who she was becoming. That evening, Lynn practiced for the last time in her apartment. Her neighbors had grown used to the sound over the past 2 weeks. The woman next door had even slipped a note under her door saying how much she enjoyed listening. Lynn made Professor Wu's tea and sipped it as she played through the concerto one final time. Then she laid out her clothes for tomorrow. Not the cafeteria uniform, but a simple black dress she had kept from her performing days. It hung looser on her frame now, but still fit well enough. She slept fitfully, dreaming of concert halls and faceless audiences. Morning brought a pale sun and cool breeze. Lynn arrived at the college earlier than usual, heading straight to the performance hall for her scheduled rehearsal time. The space was larger than she expected, with tiered seating and professional lighting. The grand piano waited on stage, its lid propped fully open. A student was finishing his rehearsal as she arrived, a violinist playing a simplified version of a Paganini caprice. Dean Wright stood at the side of the stage making notes on a clipboard. He looked up as Lynn approached. "Ah, the cafeteria pianist," he said with a distracted smile. "You're next." 10 minutes only, please, we're running behind." Lynn nodded and waited quietly in the wings. When the violinist finished, she walked onto the stage feeling the familiar flutter in her stomach that always preceded a performance. It had been 5 years since she last stood on any stage. The piano bench felt different from what she was used to. Higher, less worn. Lynn adjusted it carefully, then placed her modified sheet music on the stand, though she hardly needed it anymore. She took a deep breath and began to play. The hall's acoustics were magnificent, carrying the sound to every corner of the space. Lynn lost herself in the music, forgetting about Dean Wright and his clipboard, forgetting about the talent show and its expectations. For these few minutes, there was only Rachmaninoff and the piano, and her hands finding their way through the intricate patterns of notes. When she finished the cadenza and moved into the closing section of the first movement, she became aware of silence in the hall. Dean Wright had stopped writing. 2 janitors had paused their work to listen. A group of students had gathered at the back doors. Lynn played the final chords and lifted her hands from the keys. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Dean Wright cleared his throat. That was unexpected. He adjusted his glasses, looking at her with new eyes. "You've played before." Lynn nodded. "Where did you study?" he asked. "Beijing Central Conservatory," Lynn answered quietly. "A long time ago." Dean Wright's expression shifted from surprise to confusion to something like embarrassment. "I see. Well, this changes things. Perhaps we should move you to the faculty portion of the program rather than the—" "No," Lynn interrupted. "I'm not faculty. I work in the cafeteria. That's where I belong in your program." The dean looked like he wanted to argue but thought better of it. "As you wish. Your performance time is 8:15 p.m. Please be in the green room by 8 Wang." He hesitated, then added, "Thank you for taking this seriously. It will certainly add something different to our event." Lynn returned to the cafeteria for her shift, aware of the curious glances from students who had witnessed her rehearsal. Word was spreading, but she focused on her work, finding comfort in its simplicity. Serving coffee and clearing tables required no interpretation, no emotional exposure. Professor Chen appeared at her counter mid-afternoon, looking troubled. "I heard your rehearsal," he said. "Why didn't you tell me you could actually play?" Lynn met his gaze steadily. "You didn't ask. You assumed." He had the grace to look ashamed. "I did." "I'm sorry." "No need," Lynn said, handing him his usual coffee. "I hadn't touched a piano in 5 years before you gave me that music. In a way, you did me a favor. Will you play the simplified version tonight?" he asked. "No," Lynn said. "I'll play as well as I can. Not as well as I once did, but the best I can do now." Professor Chen nodded slowly. "I'll be there. Front row." He hesitated. "The cookies have been the highlight of my mornings, you know." "Even before I knew you were a pianist." Lynn smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "Good to know I excel at something besides Rachmaninoff." The afternoon passed in a blur of customers and cleanup. Lynn's manager let her leave an hour early to prepare for the talent show. "Make us proud," the older woman said with a wink. At home, Lynn showered and dressed carefully in her black dress. She did her hair in a simple bun and added a pair of small pearl earrings, a gift from her husband on their 5th anniversary. Looking in the mirror, she saw traces of the concert pianist she had been, now blended with the cafeteria worker she had become. Both were real. Both were her. The campus was transformed when she returned that evening. Colored lights illuminated the walkways, and crowds of students and faculty members streamed toward the performance hall. Posters advertised the talent show, highlighting the special faculty performances at the beginning and end of the program. Lynn slipped in through the stage door, finding her way to the green room where other performers waited nervously. A literature professor practiced a comical, dramatic monologue in one corner. 2 science teachers rehearsed what appeared to be a chemistry-themed magic trick. No one paid attention to the quiet woman in black who sat alone, flexing her fingers gently. Professor Wu appeared briefly to wish her luck. "Remember," he said quietly, "truth, not perfection." Professor Chen arrived moments later with a small bunch of flowers. "For after," he said, placing them on a side table. "Break a leg, as they say." As 8 p.m. approached, Lynn felt the familiar pre-performance ritual settling over her. The deepening concentration, the heightened awareness, the narrowing of focus to the music alone. She had thought these sensations lost to her forever. A student volunteer appeared at the door. 5 minutes until the cafeteria pianist, she announced, checking her list. "Who's playing from the cafeteria staff?" Lynn stood up. "I am." The student looked her up and down, taking in the black dress and the composed demeanor. "Oh, I thought—" "Never mind. You're on after the dean's welcome speech. Wait by the curtain until they announce you." Lynn nodded and made her way to the wings of the stage. Through a gap in the curtains, she could see the hall was packed. Dean Wright stood at the microphone, welcoming everyone to the 25th Annual Faculty Talent Show. "We have a special treat for you tonight," he was saying. "As our opening performer, we have a member of our cafeteria staff who will be attempting—" He emphasized the word with a small chuckle that died in his throat as he caught sight of Lynn waiting in the wings, poised and focused. He cleared his throat. "Please welcome Lin Wei, who will be playing the first movement of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3. As Lin walked onto the stage to scattered applause, She heard confused whispers ripple through the audience. She took her place at the piano, adjusted the bench, and placed her hands on the keys. For a moment, she closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the past 5 years, the grief, the silence, the slow rebuild of her life. Then she began to play. The first notes hung in the air like a question, gentle, inquiring, almost tentative. Rachmaninoff's opening melody filled the hall. Lynn's fingers moved with measured precision, feeling the familiar contours of the keys beneath them. The audience sat in puzzled silence, their expectations suddenly uncertain. They had come for a joke, the cafeteria worker stumbling through a piece far beyond her abilities. Instead, they heard music played with unmistakable understanding. Lynn kept her eyes on the keyboard, focusing entirely on the conversation between her hands and the piano. The left hand still struggled with certain passages, but Professor Wu's modifications allowed her to navigate through them without breaking the musical line. Her right hand carried the melody with growing confidence, shaping each phrase with subtle dynamics. As the piece progressed into more technically demanding sections, Lynn felt a familiar sensation spreading through her body, a kind of heightened awareness where time seemed to expand. In this state, each note had space to breathe. Each finger movement became deliberate rather than rushed. It was a feeling she had thought lost forever. From the corner of her eye, she could see Dean Wright standing frozen at the side of the stage, his mouth slightly open. In the front row, Professor Chen leaned forward in his seat, watching her hands with disbelief. Professor Wu sat a few rows back, eyes closed, a small smile on his face. The cadenza approached, that moment when the orchestra falls silent and the pianist takes flight alone. Lynn took a deep breath and plunged in, her fingers dancing across the keyboard in intricate patterns. This was the passage she had practiced most intensively, modifying fingerings to accommodate her weakened left hand, while maintaining the essential spirit of Rachmaninoff's writing. Her body swayed slightly as she played, moving with the music rather than against it. A drop of sweat trickled down her temple, but she barely noticed. There was only the music now, the complex harmonies, the soaring melodies, the thundering bass notes that resonated through the hall. When she reached the final chords of the movement and lifted her hands from the keyboard, the silence that followed seemed to vibrate with tension. Then someone in the back row began to clap. Another person joined, then another. Within seconds, the entire hall erupted in applause and cheers. Students stood from their seats, professors looked at each other in amazement, and even the technical staff paused their work to join the ovation. Lynn remained seated at the piano, momentarily unable to move. The sound washed over her like a wave, familiar yet somehow new. It had been so long since she had heard applause, since she had earned it. Dean Wright recovered enough to step onto the stage, gesturing for Lynn to stand and acknowledge the audience. She rose shakily and offered a small bow, the movement coming back to her from years of concert habits. "Ladies and gentlemen," the dean said into the microphone, his voice slightly unsteady. "Lin Wei." The applause intensified. Someone in the audience shouted, "Bravo," and others took up the call. Lynn bowed again, then made her way off the stage, legs trembling beneath her. In the wings, she leaned against a wall, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried her through the performance began to ebb, leaving her lightheaded and emotional. A stagehand offered her a bottle of water, which she accepted gratefully. Professor Wu was the first to find her backstage. "Truth," he said simply, his eyes bright with unshed tears. That was truth. Professor Chen appeared moments later, still looking slightly dazed. "I don't understand," he said. "You're actually Lin Wei? The Lin Wei who performed with the London Philharmonic? Who recorded the complete Chopin etudes for Deutsche Grammophon?" Lynn nodded, taking another sip of water to soothe her dry throat. "But you disappeared 5 years ago," he continued. "There were rumors you'd died, or retired to teach in some remote conservatory. And all this time you've been working in our cafeteria? Life happens," Lynn said quietly. "Things change." Dean Wright pushed through the growing crowd of faculty members who had gathered backstage. "Ms. Wei," he said formally, extending his hand, "I must apologize for the misunderstanding. Had we known of your background—" "Then you wouldn't have asked me to play," Lynn interrupted gently. "And I might never have touched a piano again." The dean looked taken aback, then thoughtful. "Perhaps everything happens for a reason," he said finally. The student volunteer appeared, looking frazzled. Excuse me, but we need to continue with the program. The chemistry demonstration is next, and they need to set up their equipment. The faculty members dispersed, returning to their seats for the rest of the show. Lynn found a quiet corner in the green room where she could sit and process what had just happened. Her hands were still trembling slightly, from exertion, from emotion, from the sudden reemergence of a part of herself she had buried long ago. The talent show continued without her. She could hear laughter and applause from the hall as other acts performed. The chemistry demonstration with its colorful explosions, the literature professor's dramatic reading, a physics teacher's surprisingly good juggling routine. It all seemed to be happening in another world. A young woman peeked into the green room, the same music student who had caught Lynn playing in the practice room days earlier. "Excuse me," she said hesitantly. "I just wanted to say your performance was incredible. I'm a piano performance major, and I've been struggling with motivation lately. Hearing you play like that after everything you've been through, it gives me hope." Lynn looked up surprised. "How do you know what I've been through?" The student blushed. "Sorry, I Googled you during intermission. There were articles about your accident, your husband. I didn't mean to pry." "It's public knowledge," Lynn said with a small shrug. "Ancient history now." "Not so ancient," the student said. "And clearly not history either. You're still playing, still making music." After the student left, Lynn sat thinking about her words. Was she still making music? One performance after 5 years of silence hardly constituted a career. Yet something had awakened in her tonight that couldn't simply be put back to. So again, the talent show ended with a group number. Faculty, members from various departments singing a comedy song about student excuses. As the audience filed out of the hall, Lynn slipped away through the stage door, not ready to face questions and congratulations from strangers. The night air felt cool on her face as she walked across the nearly empty campus. A few students recognized her and pointed, whispering to each other, but no one approached her. She was grateful for the solitude. At home, Lynn carefully hung up her black dress and removed her pearl earrings. She made a cup of tea and sat on her sofa, looking at the piano in the corner. For the first time in 5 years, she had left it uncovered. Her phone buzzed with messages. Professor Chen asking if she would consider teaching master classes. Professor Wu sending a simple "thank you for the music." The cafeteria manager expressing amazement and pride. Lynn read them all but responded to none. Tomorrow would be time enough for decisions. For now, she simply wanted to sit with the feeling of having reclaimed a piece of herself she thought was lost forever. The next morning, Lynn arrived at work at her usual time. She put on her cafeteria uniform and began preparing for the day. When the first students arrived for coffee, they did double takes upon recognizing her. But Lynn served them with her usual quiet efficiency. Professor Chen was among the first faculty members to appear. He approached her counter with a different expression than usual, a mixture of respect and uncertainty. "You're still here," he said, sounding surprised. Lynn nodded, pouring his regular coffee. "Where else would I be? I thought, after last night, perhaps you wouldn't come back." "I have a job," Lynn said simply. "I made a commitment, but surely you could teach or perform again," he pressed. "The music department would create a position for you in a heartbeat." Lynn handed him his coffee and the usual cookie. "Perhaps someday. For now, this is where I need to be." Professor Chen looked like he wanted to argue but thought better of it. "The dean wants to speak with you when you have time." "No pressure," he added quickly. "Just options." Throughout the day, Lynn dealt with curious stares and whispered conversations. Students who had never noticed her before now asked for selfies. Faculty members who had barely spoken to her suddenly wanted to chat. Through it all, Lynn maintained her calm demeanor, neither encouraging nor discouraging the attention. During her lunch break, she found herself walking to the music building, drawn there by a force she no longer wished to resist. Practice room 3 was occupied, but she could hear a student working on a Beethoven sonata, struggling with a difficult passage. Without conscious decision, Lynn knocked on the door. The student, a young man with disheveled hair and tired eyes, opened it with an annoyed expression that quickly changed to surprise. "You're the pianist from last night. May I show you something?" Lynn asked, gesturing to the piano. The student stepped aside. "Wadi,